Hi, in this physics lesson we're going to take a look at a position versus time graph so that we can talk through, we're not doing any calculations here, but just talking through what a graph like this means and how it reflects the relationship between position, time, and velocity. So let's take a look at this graph and talk about what it means. If we look at each axis, we see our y-axis here is your position measured in meters. And your x-axis, the horizontal axis, is your time measured in seconds. So for this graph, if we take a look at each individual part of the graph, we see that we have a few different pieces with varying slopes. Now the slope in a position versus time graph, it's important to recognize what that slope actually means. And if we think about some of our physics equations, your velocity is equal to your displacement over time, and in units your velocity is measured in meters per second. Now that's really important because if we take a look, our y-axis is measured in meters, our x-axis is measured in seconds. So when you're looking at the slope of the line for a position versus time graph, the slope of that line represents your velocity. And let's take a look at an application on that on one portion of our graph. So if we take a look just at this first piece right here, we start out at 0, 0, and we go up to the point 2, 2. So if we were to take a look at how our position changed, we traveled a distance of 2 meters, and we traveled that distance of 2 meters in 2 seconds. So for that portion of the graph, if we were to calculate velocity, velocity is your displacement. We traveled 2 meters in 2 seconds. So that line has a slope of 1, which means our velocity during that interval was 1 meter per second. That's the speed that we were traveling at the beginning of this trip. Now let's talk about what's happening to velocity for the rest of our graph and how that relates to position and time. So here, if we were to take a look at this next portion, we can see that this portion of our graph is a little bit steeper than the first part that we looked at. And that means when you have a steeper slope that you're going to have a larger value for velocity, it means that you're moving faster. In this case, we covered a distance of about 2 meters, but in only 1 second. If you look, we reached that point of 4 meters from our starting point by the time we get to 3 seconds. So from here to here, in that second portion, we traveled a distance of 2 meters in only 1 second. So our velocity was faster. Our velocity was 2 meters per second over that interval. Now let's talk about for our graph when we see it level off, what that actually means in terms of position and time. So if you look at the position here on our y-axis, you can see that that position of 4 is not changing anywhere during that interval, which means that we are literally staying in the exact same place. So the position remains the same, and if you think about what that means in terms of velocity, if you're staying in one place, that means you're not moving, your velocity is 0. It also, if you look at the line, reflects a horizontal line. Horizontal lines have a slope of 0, so that lets us know that we are not moving over that interval of time. So from 3 to 5 seconds, we're standing still. Now, here we see that we have a negative slope for the first time. So if we look at this next portion, this long negative sloping line that we see here, let's talk about what a negative line means in terms of velocity. Because we think oftentimes of velocity in terms of how fast something is moving. So if you have a high velocity or a steep slope, you're moving very quickly. If you have 0 velocity, it means that you're not moving. So what does it mean to have a negative velocity? Well, one thing that's important to keep in mind is velocity is your displacement over time, which means that direction matters. And so for velocity, a positive slope means that you're moving in a positive direction. A negative slope just means that you're moving in a negative or the opposite direction. So this would indicate that at this point on our journey, we pause, we turn around, and we start walking in the opposite direction until the 7-second mark is reached. So that's what this negatively sloping line reflects, is that our velocity is actually going to be negative, meaning we're moving the opposite way. Then from there, again, we're switching from negative to positive, so that means we're turning around and we're walking back the opposite direction, the same way we originally started walking. So we're back in that positive direction, and once we get to that 9-second mark, our position is 0. So that means we're actually ending up at the exact point that we started at, which is a little bit tricky to conceptualize because on this graph, this point is not connecting to this point. But what it means when you're looking at position is that if you consider positive to be a certain direction, negative position means the opposite direction, and whenever you get to 0, that means you're back at that starting point. So this graph would be reflective of something like if we said that positive position is that direction. So if I began walking in that direction, paused for a certain period of time, turned around and walked back in the opposite direction, and then turned around and walked back to my starting point, that's what we're seeing here in this graph. So when you have positive and negative values for position and positive and negative values for velocity, just keep in mind that that refers to not positive or negative necessarily, but direction. Think of it as one way and the opposite way, one direction and the opposite direction. And sometimes it's a little easier to conceptualize if we think of it as traveling east and then traveling west, or traveling north and then traveling south, rather than putting pluses and minuses on the position. For more questions, please feel free to watch our other videos, subscribe to our channel, or you can visit our website at www.sandersontestprep.com. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.